The billionaire walked into the diner, hiding more than just his sorrow. He was running from a secret that could ruin him. The rain hammered against the windows, drowning out the world outside as a simple waitress unknowingly became his last hope. What happens next will shock you. The diner was quiet, the soft clink of silverware the only sound that broke through the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. Outside, the city was drowned in a gray fog, streets slick with water and headlights blurring in the distance. Inside, Gracie's diner felt like an island of warmth, the flickering neon sign above the door casting a welcoming glow over the worn-out booths and cracked vinyl seats. Emily Carter moved between tables, a towel draped over her shoulder, wiping down surfaces with a practiced hand. Her honey-brown hair was loosely tied back in a ponytail, strands falling out of place as she worked. There was an ease to her movements, like this was home, like she belonged here. And for a while she had. It was the same crowd as always. The regulars who'd sit at the counter, nodding hello to Emily like old friends. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was the way the lights seemed to be dimming earlier than usual. But there was a tension in the air, a shift, subtle but unmistakable. The bell above the door jingled, and Emily glanced up, her smile already on her lips, ready to greet another weary customer. Then she saw him. A man in a suit, dark and slightly rumpled, stepped inside. He didn't look like he belonged. Not here, anyway. His shoes were polished, his collar neatly pressed, but his eyes, dark, hollow, spoke of exhaustion. The kind of tiredness you don't get from a long day's work. The kind that comes from a weight much heavier than any job could carry. He walked to the farthest booth, sliding into the corner, his back facing the window, as if he didn't want to see the world outside. Emily's instincts kicked in, and she wiped her hands on her apron before moving toward him. Her smile still steady, though a little softer now. "Hey there," she said, her voice light, warm. "What can I get you today?" He glanced up at her, his eyes a little sharper than she expected, but then softened. His lips twitched into something like a half-smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just coffee," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken in hours. "Maybe longer." "Coming right up," Emily replied, sensing the weight behind his words. She turned and walked to the counter, keeping her back straight. There was something about this guy, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the suit or the fact that he looked like he belonged somewhere else. It was the way he held himself, like he was trying to disappear into the shadows, like he didn't want to be seen. She poured a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, and made her way back to his booth. As she set the cup down in front of him, their eyes met again. This time, his gaze lingered just a moment longer, like he was searching for something in her face. "You okay?" Emily asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. She couldn't help herself, something about him felt off. He blinked, his expression faltering. "Yeah, just tired." She nodded slowly, still standing beside the table. For a moment, the air between them hung heavy, like he was debating whether to say more. Finally, he looked up at her, his lips parting as if he were going to say something, but then he shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said, exhaling sharply. "I'm not good company today." Emily didn't back away. Instead, she gave him a small, understanding smile. "I get it. It's been one of those days for me too." She leaned against the edge of the booth, folding her arms casually. "Sometimes all you need is a cup of coffee and some quiet. And I can promise you this place, it's got plenty of both." He gave a short laugh, the sound low and weary. There was something vulnerable about it, something that didn't fit the polished man sitting in front of her. "I'm sure," he said, his voice softening. "It's just, everything feels so out of control." Emily nodded, a sympathetic look crossing her face. "I hear you. The world's a mess these days. You just have to hang on, you know?" He stared into his coffee cup, tracing the rim with a finger. "Yeah, hanging on," he muttered, almost to himself. "That's exactly it." She stood there for a beat, unsure if she should leave him alone or keep talking. But there was something in his tone that made her want to stay. Something that made her want to ask more about why he looked so lost. "You want to talk about it?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm, like she was offering him a lifeline. Sometimes it helps. He blinked at her, surprised by the question. It was like he wasn't used to people asking. Maybe he hadn't had anyone ask in a long time. Slowly, he exhaled, then nodded, his eyes flickering toward the window as though he were trying to escape the conversation. "I'm David," he said quietly. "David Monroe." Emily took a half step back, her mind processing the name. Monroe. It sounded familiar, but it didn't click right away. She gave him a nod. "Nice to meet you, David. I'm Emily, and I'll be right here if you need anything, okay?" David gave her a small, tight smile. "Thanks." She hesitated a moment longer, but then turned and walked back to the counter. As she did, she felt a subtle pull at her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye, and she was about to find out just how much. The rain beat steadily against the diner's windows, a soft rhythm that seemed to echo David's mood as he sat in silence. Emily, bustling behind the counter, kept glancing over at him. There was something in the way he held himself, something distant, like he was trapped inside his own thoughts. His fingers barely moved as he stirred his coffee, the surface of the dark liquid rippling faintly. Emily's mind wandered, drawn to the stranger. She'd seen plenty of people come and go in Gracie's diner, tourists passing through, businessmen on their lunch breaks, the elderly regulars who always took the same corner booth, but David felt different. He wasn't just here to escape the weather. There was something deeper, something he was running from, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. Her curiosity tugged at her as she wiped down the counter for the second time, not really needing to. She couldn't remember the last time a customer had unsettled her like this. The soft clink of a spoon against the cup broke the silence, and Emily turned, meeting his eyes for the first time since the brief exchange earlier. "I don't usually talk much," David said, his voice low but steady, as though he were choosing his words carefully. Emily smiled, leaning against the counter. "That's okay. I'm not a huge talker either. Sometimes it's nice to just sit in silence. Let the world pass by." David's lips curved up a fraction, but it was more a reflex than anything genuine. "Yeah, I guess it's the quiet that gets to me." The air between them shifted. There was more to his words, something unsaid, like he was offering her just enough to keep her interested without fully revealing anything. Emily could tell he wasn't the type to share easily. People like him rarely were, but her instincts told her to press just a little further. "I get that," she replied, her voice quieter now. "Quiet can be loud sometimes." David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "How so?" Emily glanced out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Well, when you're stuck with your own thoughts for too long, they tend to get noisy, like they're screaming for attention." His gaze flickered over her face, studying her more intently now. "Sounds like you know what that feels like." She nodded, her eyes momentarily distant. "Yeah, I do." She shook her head as if to shake off the heaviness of it. "But that's life, right? Sometimes you just have to sit with the noise and wait for it to fade." David fell silent for a beat, staring into his coffee again, his fingers still absent-mindedly tracing the edge of his cup. Emily could see the conflict in him, the way he was fighting against something, trying to push it all away. There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep running from it." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what he meant. Did he mean the rain, his job, or something deeper? But she could tell he wasn't just talking about the weather anymore. There was a heaviness in his tone that made her want to ask more. "What are you running from?" she asked gently, her voice soft but steady. David looked up at her then, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. It was clear she had caught him off guard, but for some reason, he didn't shy away from her gaze. He sighed, leaning back slightly, his shoulders dropping in defeat. "It's everything. My life, the decisions I've made, the way everything's falling apart." His voice cracked just slightly on the last words, and for the first time since she'd met him, Emily saw the real vulnerability beneath the polished exterior. It made her chest tighten in sympathy. She leaned in, her tone warm and inviting. "You don't have to tell me everything, but sometimes just talking about it can help. You'd be surprised how much weight comes off when you're heard." David hesitated, as though weighing his options, before shaking his head slowly. I'm not good at this. Talking. I'm better at handling things on my own. Emily smiled faintly, giving him a small, understanding nod. Most people are, but even the toughest people need someone to listen every now and then. He stared at her for a moment, his eyes searching her face, maybe looking for a hint of insincerity, but finding none. The silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with unspoken words. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke again. Maybe that's why I'm here. I don't know. I thought maybe talking to a stranger would make it all feel less real. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, like he regretted admitting that much. Emily felt a rush of sympathy. He wasn't just any stranger. He was someone who had been carrying his burden alone for too long. And as much as she'd like to keep her distance, she couldn't ignore the fact that in some way he was reaching out. You don't have to carry it all alone, she said softly, her voice full of sincerity. It might not fix everything, but sharing the weight can make a difference. David looked at her, something flickering in his eyes, a mixture of gratitude and confusion. I wish it were that easy. For a moment, Emily was silent, just looking at him, wondering if he would let her in. But as the quiet stretched on, she realized she didn't need him to open up right now. She just needed him to know that someone cared, that the weight didn't have to be carried in isolation. With a soft sigh, she stood up straight again, offering a gentle smile. If you change your mind, I'll be here. David didn't say anything, but she noticed the way his shoulders seemed to relax just a little, the tightness in his face easing. As Emily turned to walk back to the counter, her mind lingered on the conversation. She wasn't sure what David was going through, but the tension in his voice, the sadness in his eyes, it felt like something more than just a bad day. She felt it, too, this strange connection that pulled her to him, even though she barely knew him. Something was coming, and she had no idea just how much her life was about to change. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, but the air still felt thick, as if the world outside hadn't quite decided whether to settle or keep on rushing. Inside Gracie's diner, Emily found herself sneaking glances at David, who was still sitting in the corner booth. The once steaming cup of coffee in front of him was now cold, untouched. His eyes were fixed on the window, distant as ever, and Emily could see that the weight of whatever he was carrying wasn't lifting. For a moment, she wondered if she should just leave him to his thoughts. She had a job to do, after all, but something kept pulling her back toward him. His sadness, so palpable, had a way of creeping into her own chest, like an echo of an unspoken story. She hadn't expected to care this much about a man she'd just met, especially a man who, on paper, seemed so different from her. But there it was, that strange sense of wanting to help, to ease the burden even just a little. She grabbed a rag from the counter and began wiping down the same spot she had already cleaned twice. Anything to keep her hands busy. Anything to keep her from overthinking. It wasn't until she was about to turn away that she heard his voice again. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low, almost inaudible. I didn't mean to unload all that on you. Emily glanced over, surprised by the admission. David had been quiet for so long, she hadn't expected him to speak, let alone apologize. It's okay, she said softly, her voice steady. You don't have to apologize for being real. David didn't respond immediately. He sat there, his eyes never leaving the window, but there was something in his posture now, something that told her he wasn't just hiding from the storm outside, but from something far bigger, far deeper. She wanted to ask him more, to push for answers, but she sensed that he wasn't ready for that. Instead, she gave him the space he seemed to need. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with the weight of things left unsaid. For a moment, the world outside felt just as muted as the one inside, as if time itself had slowed. Finally, David stirred. He shifted in his seat, his hand brushing the edge of the coffee cup in front of him as he let out a long breath. His shoulders slumped just a little more. I don't know how it got this far, he murmured, his voice rougher now, the facade beginning to crack. It all feels like a house of cards, ready to fall. One bad decision after another, and I've been pretending I can fix it, pretending that I have control. But I don't. Not anymore. Emily's heart thudded a little harder in her chest. There it was, he was finally opening up, letting some of the truth spill out. She took a careful step forward, the instinct to offer him comfort rising inside her. "You don't have to fix everything alone," she said quietly. "Not everything's meant to be fixed in one go." David let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I wish that were true. I wish I could believe that." Emily tilted her head, her gaze softening. What if you didn't have to be the one who fixes everything? What if you just let it fall? Let it be messy for a while." He looked at her, then really looked at her. There was something raw in his eyes, a flash of vulnerability that made her wish she could just take away all the weight from his shoulders. But she knew better than to think she could fix him. Nobody could. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice lower now, almost desperate. "You don't understand. I built my whole life on this idea that I can control everything. And now it's all falling apart. My company's in trouble, my reputation's in tatters, and no one trusts me anymore. Not even the people closest to me." Emily's chest tightened, and for a moment, she felt the sting of his words, the heaviness of them. She understood more than he realized. She had seen people like him before. People who had everything, but nothing at the same time. People who thought they could outrun their problems, but only ended up trapped by them. "You don't have to do it all on your own," she repeated, her voice steady, though the words felt heavier now. "You've been carrying this alone for so long, David. Maybe it's time to let someone else in." David's gaze softened as it met hers, and for the briefest of moments, she saw the flicker of a man who was tired of pretending, tired of being strong when he didn't have to be. He wasn't ready to admit it yet, not to himself, and definitely not to her. But Emily could see it, the cracks beneath the surface, the exhaustion, the fear, the weight of his own self-doubt. "I'm just scared," he said, barely above a whisper. "Scared that if I stop, everything will crumble, and I'll be left with nothing." There was a long pause. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle into her chest. She knew what it felt like to be scared, to feel like the world might swallow you whole if you stopped moving. But sometimes, stopping was the only way forward. "You don't have to be alone in this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Sometimes letting go is the only way to start fixing it." David's eyes lingered on hers for a moment longer. Then he looked down at his hands, the flickering neon light from the diner sign casting a soft glow on his face. "I don't know if I can," he whispered, "but maybe I can try." And for the first time since he walked into Gracie's diner, Emily saw a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, spark in his eyes. It wasn't much, but for David, it was a start. The storm outside had calmed into a soft drizzle, but the tension in the diner hung thick in the air, as though time itself was holding its breath. Emily couldn't shake the image of David's face when he said, "Maybe I can try." That small, fragile spark of hope was the most she'd seen from him since he walked in, and she wasn't sure if it was enough to shift the weight of everything pressing down on him. But it was something. Emily kept busy, her hands moving with the practiced motions of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Wiping down the counter, adjusting the salt shakers, filling up coffee cups. But her mind kept drifting back to David, still sitting in the same booth. He hadn't said much since their last conversation, just staring at his cup of coffee, turning it slowly in his hands like it was the only thing holding him together. She wasn't sure what to say next, but she knew she couldn't just let him sit in silence forever. He needed something more than just small talk now. He needed to believe that, even in his darkest moments, he wasn't entirely alone. Emily glanced over at him, hesitating before taking a few steps toward his booth. "Hey, David," she said gently, her voice soft. "How's the coffee? Still holding up?" He glanced up at her, his eyes tired but a little softer than before. A small, weary smile tugged at his lips. "It's good," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Better than I expected, considering it's a diner." Emily couldn't help but laugh softly. "Hey, Gracie's diner isn't exactly the Ritz, but we try our best." David let out a small chuckle, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. Like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely consumed by the mess of his life. She took a cautious step closer. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about everything falling apart. She bit her lip, feeling a little unsure about pushing further, but she knew this was important. Maybe it feels like it's all crashing down, but it doesn't have to stay that way. You can rebuild, David. Things don't always stay broken forever. He raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. It's not that simple. You don't know the mess I've made. Emily paused, her heart aching for him. She could feel the weight of his words in her own chest. He thinks he's beyond saving. But she wasn't going to give up on him. Not yet. I know that feeling, she said softly, her voice steady. It's easy to believe that once things break, they're gone for good. But sometimes the hardest part is just giving yourself permission to try again. Not because it'll be easy, but because you deserve the chance to make it right. David didn't say anything at first, just stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and vulnerability in his eyes. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes before a breakthrough, when the walls people build around themselves start to crumble. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. I don't know if I can fix it. I've messed up so much already. It feels too late to change anything. Emily leaned in slightly, her voice warm but firm. It's never too late, David. The world might tell you that you're finished, that you're defined by your mistakes. But that's not true. It's how you choose to move forward that matters. She paused, her eyes locking with his. It doesn't matter how many times you fall. What matters is how you get back up. David's gaze softened, and for the first time since they'd started talking, he didn't look like he was carrying the weight of the world. He looked uncertain, yes, but also curious, like he was beginning to believe in the possibility of something different. Maybe I've been trying to fix everything by myself because I thought if I admitted I needed help, it would mean I was weak, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Emily's heart squeezed at the vulnerability in his words. She could see how much it cost him to admit that. You're not weak for needing help, David, she said gently. You're human, and no one has to go through this alone. There was a long pause as he took in her words. For a moment, neither of them moved, as though they were both waiting for something to shift. Then, slowly, David leaned back in his booth, his shoulders a little less tense, the burden a little lighter. I don't know what this thing is between us, he said slowly, glancing up at her. But I'm glad I met you today. I think I'm starting to see that maybe there's more to life than just trying to hold everything together. Emily smiled softly, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. Sometimes you don't have to hold everything together. Sometimes you just need to be honest with yourself about what you really need. David gave her a slow nod, as though he were processing her words, trying them on for size. And for the first time since he sat down in that booth, he looked like he might believe her. Maybe I'll start there, he said quietly. Emily's smile widened, and as she turned to walk back to the counter, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. There was hope in the air now, small, fragile hope, but it was real. And that was a start. David sat there, hands still wrapped around his coffee cup, but now his fingers were fidgeting. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but Emily noticed. He was still wrestling with something inside, something deeper than the surface conversation they'd been having. She could tell. She could always tell when something was weighing heavily on someone. The diner was quieter now, the lull between the rain and the soft hum of the jukebox filling the space. Emily had returned to wiping down the counter, but her mind was still on him. On the way, he seemed to be trying to figure out how to start over, how to let go. His words had hung in the air, and it felt like there was so much more he wasn't saying. She wanted to push him to ask more, but there was a fragility to him now, a tenderness that made her cautious, like one wrong word might break him again. But she didn't back away. Emily had learned that sometimes the hardest thing was to keep showing up, even when the person across from you was afraid to face their own reflection. After a long silence, David shifted in his seat. I don't know if I'm ready for this, he murmured, his voice soft but laced with doubt. Emily paused in her movements, sensing a shift in his tone. She turned to face him, her gaze steady. Ready for what? She asked, her voice gentle but firm. He took a deep breath and met her eyes, the vulnerability in his expression still raw. To admit that I've failed, to let everything crumble and just hope something good comes from it. The weight of his words landed in her chest. She didn't have an answer for him, not the kind he was looking for. There was no magic fix, no easy solution. He was right to be afraid. Letting go wasn't easy, it was terrifying. But sometimes it was the only way forward. I get it, Emily said softly, her voice a little more fragile now too. It's hard to let everything go when you feel like the world is watching. But sometimes we're not meant to hold on to everything. Sometimes letting go is how you make room for something new. David's gaze softened, but his eyes darkened with the kind of uncertainty that had been there since he first sat down. What if I let go and everything falls apart? What if I'm not enough to fix what's broken? She stepped closer to him, leaning against the booth, her voice quiet. I think we all wonder that. We wonder if we're enough. But the truth is, you don't have to fix everything. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to start. And sometimes that's enough. David didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, his expression conflicted. He wanted to believe her, Emily could see that. But there was a part of him that was terrified. Terrified of failing. Terrified of admitting he didn't have control over everything. Do you ever feel like you're not enough? He asked quietly. Almost like an afterthought, his voice tight. The question took Emily by surprise. She hadn't expected him to turn it back on her. But the truth was, she had felt that way, more times than she cared to admit. She took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts, knowing that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about letting him know that he wasn't alone in this feeling. Yeah, she said softly, her voice steady. I think everyone feels like that sometimes, like they're not enough. But that doesn't mean we're broken. It just means we're human. And sometimes being human means we need help. We need other people to help us when we can't carry it all ourselves. David looked at her for a long moment, his face softening as he processed her words. She could see the battle in his eyes, his pride, his fear, his guilt, all warring inside him. Finally, he let out a slow breath, rubbing his hand over his face. I wish I could just let go of all this. I wish I could just breathe. Emily smiled softly, her voice filled with gentle reassurance. You can. You don't have to carry everything, David. You can let go and you can still be okay. You just have to trust yourself enough to take that first step. He met her eyes again, the walls he'd built around himself starting to crack, just a little. There was no sudden moment of clarity, no perfect answer that would solve all his problems. But in that moment, Emily saw the smallest flicker of hope in his eyes, the faintest glimmer that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to try. I don't know if I can do this alone, he admitted, his voice low, vulnerable. Emily reached out, her hand resting on the edge of the booth, close enough for him to feel the warmth of it, but not forcing him to take it. You don't have to, she said softly. You've got me, okay? You've got people who care, even if you don't always see it. David's gaze softened, his eyes searching hers for a moment. Then, with a faint, reluctant smile, he nodded. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, I'll try. I'll try to let go. Emily's heart lifted at the words, but there was still so much uncertainty hanging in the air. The journey ahead for David wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth having ever was. But the first step was always the hardest, and today, David had taken it. As Emily moved away, back toward the counter, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, she believed David might be ready to face the change he needed, no matter how difficult it would be. The rain had finally stopped, but the tension inside the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Emily had spent the last hour watching David, offering quiet support when needed, but he seemed to be processing something deeper now. She noticed the change in him. His posture was less tense, his eyes a little less clouded. The words they had shared had begun to settle into him, though Emily knew he wasn't fully out of the woods yet. She didn't expect him to be, not so soon. But as the evening wore on, she began to sense a shift in the air, something that didn't feel quite right. The way David's hand gripped his coffee cup, the way he kept looking out the window as if waiting for something or someone to arrive. His earlier openness had cracked a door, But now, the silence between them felt heavier, more strained. Emily couldn't pinpoint it, but something was changing. The bell over the diner's door jingled again, and Emily glanced up, a reflexive smile already in place, until she saw who walked in. A man in a sharp, tailored suit. Well-groomed, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses, even though it was now evening. His presence seemed to fill the room, his sharp gaze scanning the diner before settling on David. David tensed immediately, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. He didn't stand up, but his whole demeanor shifted, like a wall had suddenly come down between them. Emily felt the sudden coldness in the air, the shift in David's energy as if he were bracing for something. The man walked straight toward David, his steps deliberate, confident. Emily felt a chill creep up her spine. This wasn't just another customer. This man, he knew David. David, the man said in a low, clipped voice as he stopped at the booth. His tone was almost cold, and the way he said David's name had a note of familiarity that sent a shiver through the diner. David's eyes locked onto the man's, his jaw tightening. "What are you doing here, Spencer?" David's voice was low, but Emily could hear the strain in it, the unease. Spencer, the man in the suit, didn't respond right away. Instead, he slid into the booth across from David, his eyes never leaving him. Emily couldn't help but notice the way the man's gaze flicked toward her for just a moment, as if evaluating her presence. She quickly busied herself at the counter, trying to appear nonchalant, but her heart was racing. Something was wrong. "I've been trying to reach you," Spencer continued, his voice still sharp. "Your company's in trouble. We need to talk. Now." David's face tightened, and Emily caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a flash of fear, followed by anger. "I've told you I don't want your help," David snapped, his voice betraying his growing frustration. "I'll fix this on my own." Spencer leaned forward, his tone cutting. "You've been saying that for weeks now. But it's too late, David. The board is already moving to oust you. The company's going under, and you're too damn proud to admit it." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea what was going on, but she could tell that whatever this was, it was bigger than anything she had imagined. David's face was flushed with tension, and she saw the tightness in his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for his job. He was fighting for something much more personal. "I'm not leaving, Spencer," David said through clenched teeth. "You can't just come in here and take everything from me." Spencer's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You don't have a choice. The investors want blood, and you're the one they're coming for. You were never meant to keep control. Forever. You should have known that." David's expression faltered, and for a moment, Emily saw the crack in his armor. He wasn't just a billionaire trying to hold onto his empire. He was a man terrified of losing everything. She could see the weight of his past decisions catching up to him, the unspoken truth that had been hanging over him all this time. He wasn't just failing at business. He was failing at his own life. She couldn't stand by and watch him crumble again. "Spencer," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "you're not welcome here. And if you have business with him, you can take it outside." Spencer turned his gaze toward Emily, his eyes narrowing for a moment as if weighing her presence. There was a flicker of surprise, but then he smirked, dismissing her. "This doesn't concern you, sweetheart. Stay out of it." David's eyes flashed at the insult, but Emily could see him holding back, holding everything back. For a moment, there was silence, heavy, suffocating silence. And then, without warning, David stood up, the movement sharp and purposeful. "I said get out," he repeated, his voice now hard and commanding. "You don't get to come in here and tear everything apart. Not today." There was a beat of hesitation from Spencer, and then, as if realizing there was no more room for manipulation, he stood up, the smirk slipping from his face. "This isn't over, David," he said quietly, his voice laced with an unspoken threat. As Spencer left the diner, the door swinging shut behind him, Emily turned to look at David. He was still standing, his fists clenched at his sides, his breathing shallow. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And then David exhaled, long and deep, as if he were finally allowing himself to feel the weight of it all. "That was the last time," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "I won't let him do this to me anymore." Emily stepped forward, her hand reaching out but stopping just short of touching his arm. "David, you don't have to do this alone," she said quietly. "You don't have to keep fighting the way you've been fighting." David turned toward her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and something else, a kind of desperate hope. "I don't know how to stop fighting, Emily. I don't know how to just let go of everything." But Emily, for the first time since meeting him, understood something in that moment. It wasn't just about letting go. It was about choosing to fight differently, to fight for something that mattered. And for the first time, she saw it in him, the flicker of someone who might actually believe that change was possible. The diner was quiet now, save for the soft hum of the neon sign flickering in the corner, casting an amber glow over the room. Emily stood near the counter, her eyes on David, who was still standing by the booth, his back to her. He was staring out the window, but she could see the way his shoulders had relaxed just slightly, like the weight of Spencer's visit had made something inside him shift. David had been through a lot today. Hell, a lot in the past few weeks. Emily didn't know the full extent of his troubles, but she had seen enough to understand that he wasn't just battling a failing business empire. He was battling himself, his past mistakes, and a future that felt so uncertain he couldn't see a way out. She wanted to say something to him, to offer more than just quiet encouragement, but the words seemed to fall short. What do you say to someone like him? Someone who had been hurt, who had hurt others, and who was now standing on the edge of everything he had built, ready to either fall or find the courage to rebuild. She didn't know the answer, but what she did know was that he wasn't alone anymore. Taking a deep breath, Emily walked over to him, her footsteps quiet against the worn floors. She could feel the tension still simmering under the surface, but something about the way he held himself now, less rigid, less like a man at war with the world, told her that something had shifted in him. He didn't turn when she reached him, but he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I don't know how I got here," he said softly, his tone heavy. "How I let things spiral like this." Emily stood beside him, looking out the window at the empty street, the world outside still damp from the rain. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was one of those rare moments when two people are simply present together, no words necessary, just the understanding that, for this moment, they didn't need to explain everything. "It's not about how you got here," she said finally, her voice steady and calm. "It's about where you go from here. You can choose to keep holding onto what's breaking you, or you can let go. Take a step forward. It doesn't matter how small that step is. Just move." David looked at her then, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment, she saw the man behind the billionaire mask. The man who was still scared, still uncertain, but finally ready to face what lay ahead. "I don't know if I can," he admitted quietly. His voice was raw now, stripped of pretense. "I don't know if I can make it right, but maybe I can try. Maybe that's all I can do." Emily felt a rush of emotion at his words, relief, hope, maybe even a little sadness. She could see the battle in his eyes. She could feel the weight of his decision, even though it wasn't hers to carry. And in that moment, she knew that the hardest part wasn't the fall. It was the choice to let go and rise again. "Trying is all any of us can do," she said softly. "And you're not alone in it. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." David's eyes softened at her words, and for the first time, he allowed himself to smile. It wasn't a wide smile, nothing dramatic, but it was real. It was a moment of understanding, of shared connection, that spoke volumes more than any words could. For the first time in a long while, David Monroe didn't look like he was just surviving. He looked like he was beginning to live again. "I don't deserve this," he said, almost as a whisper, as if testing the words. "But I want to try. I want to believe that. Maybe I can be better. I don't know how yet, but I'll start." Emily nodded, her smile gentle. "That's enough." The two of them stood there for a moment longer, watching the night fall around them. The world outside might have been quiet, but inside, something had changed. Something had clicked into place. David wasn't going to fix everything overnight, and Emily wasn't going to suddenly have all the answers. But they both knew one thing. This moment right here was a turning point. And as David turned to her, a glimmer of resolve in his eyes, Emily knew that this was only the beginning. Together, they could face whatever came next.